Greetings. My name is Jeff Liston, and welcome to you all tuning in from around the world to this very special edition of the 2021 Royal Tyrrell Museum Speaker Series. The role of ethics within paleontology is an issue that has increasingly come to demand attention since the inception of our science, whether in connection with fossils from Brazil or, as it first came to my notice, the illegal export of research material from China or Mongolia. A number of meetings have been organized in recent years to address this expanding area of concern, most notably at the Haarlem 2016 meeting of the European Association of Vertebrate Paleontologists and successive workshops hosted by the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology at their annual meetings in Albuquerque in 2018 and Brisbane in 2019. Most recently, attention has been particularly focused on amber from Myanmar containing fossil material, a controversial subject which has become particularly public over the last few years, and a particular focus of the Government Affairs Committee of the SVP these past 2 years. But in truth, it has always been somewhat contentious. Ethics and illegality surrounding fossil material straddles across many areas, from ownership of and access to material, to who researches it for its publication, and even the selection of the fossil material's final repository. This means that if change is needed, then it needs to take place over many loci, which makes it perhaps the most challenging area for us as paleontologists in the 21st century. And this brings me to our special guest speaker today. The Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology and its cooperating society are proud to present Nussaibah Raja-Schoob. Nussaibah is originally from Mauritius and did her bachelor's at King's College London in geography. After completing that, she moved back to Mauritius, where she worked on a conservation project for endangered endemic birds. She then moved to Ankara, Turkey, to complete her master's in physical geography, which focused on risk analysis of natural hazards, mainly landslides and floods. She then arrived in Germany to join the paleobiology master's program at the Friedrich Alexander Universität, the University of Erlangen, Nuremberg, swiftly moving to a PhD there, which is where I first met her when I was working there just over a year ago. The primary focus of her PhD has been the responses of organisms to climate change, with particular emphasis on reefs and reef-building organisms. Dealing with fossil data, most of her time has been spent looking at how sampling affects her analysis and results, which is how she began to look at the human-related aspects of fossil sampling in paleontology, especially with regards to knowledge imbalances, power relationships, and the legacies of scientific colonialism in today's paleontology. And this leads us to the groundbreaking research of Nussaibah and her team, which it gives me great pleasure to see her presenting today. Illicit Fossils, the Ethical Dilemma in Protecting the World's Natural History. Thank you, and take it away, Nussaibah.
Hey everyone, I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about the project that I started working on together with Emma from the University of Birmingham less than a year ago. So this project really got us thinking beyond our own research and a lot about ethics and social responsibility as a paleontologist and as a researcher in general. This is a topic that applies to several fields, and before I start talking about paleontology specifically, I would like to share some of my experiences as someone who was not originally trained as a paleontologist, which has definitely marked me in the way I think about certain things. So during the second year of my bachelor's, we had a compulsory field trip to Morocco, which of course was super exciting because back then I hadn't really traveled a lot. So we landed in Morocco, all 30 students, some of whom had been carrying surveying equipment in their luggage. I was one of the first ones to be through border control, and this is when one of the lecturers who was accompanying us asked if anyone spoke French. Our translator was still back in the queue, so I volunteered. So it turns out we had been stopped by the officers for carrying spying equipment. So this was actually the surveying equipment, and we were being brought in for questioning. So there I was, sitting in the office of the person in charge, who was asking what our purpose in Morocco was. So apparently, we had no permits for carrying fieldwork in Morocco because this has never been a need before, according to the lecturer sitting next to me. So let's forget for a minute that I, as a student, should not have been in this position to start with. So eventually we were let off the hook with a warning, and we were told that we should apply formally for carrying out research in Morocco in the future. Whether this has changed or not, I can't really tell you. So 2 weeks later, still in Morocco, we were taking some measurements in a dried riverbed when we were approached by a group of locals. I wasn't asked to translate this time, but according to what we heard afterwards, one of the people was the chief of the local Berber tribe on whose land we were trespassing. Our lecturer, the same person who was stopped at the airport, first of all refused to acknowledge that the person in front of him was indeed the local chief, and was almost arrested, along with the rest of us. We were let off once again, and this kind of became a fun story that we told the others. But the reality is, we were a group of British researchers and students without the proper permits and trespassing on indigenous land. So fast forward 2 years later, I was in Mauritius working as a conservation biologist. For those who don't know, it's basically the island where the dodo used to live and where I am from. The foundation where I was working was partnered with a British conservation organization. And one of the people from there, who also had a very big say in how the decisions are made, came to visit my station. He barely acknowledged my existence, preferring the company of the rest of the team, all of whom were foreigners. It was only when he learned that I had been previously educated in Britain and had worked at a British Zoological Institute that I was suddenly deemed worthy of talking to. This represented a clear disregard of locals over non-locals and is a representation of the legacy of colonialism in the field of conservation, not just in Mauritius, but across the globe. So why am I telling you this? This is to show you that scientific colonialism, a core issue within paleontology, is present across the natural sciences, especially in field-based disciplines, and that I have been both at the giving end of scientific colonialism, especially during my time spent in Britain, because that's how we were trained as students, and the receiving end as well. But now a bit more about paleontology, which is why you probably came to this webinar. I will be focusing on 2 case studies. The first, regarding a Brazilian fossil that caused some backlash back in December over its legal status. And the second about Myanmar amber, especially with regards to the illegal trade of the gemstone and accompanying human rights issues. The Ubirajara specimen, which was found in Brazil, is around 120 million years old, and it got quite some interest because of its spear-like features on its shoulders. The only other known feathered dinosaurs from South America are early birds with modern-looking, flight-ready feathers. Only a few fossil dinosaurs have been found with similarly broad feathers, and they're all from either China or North America. So this specimen really represents a key in terms of the puzzle that we as paleontologists are trying to elucidate. So this study was published back in December 2020, and it was also stated in the publication that it was exported to Germany in 1995, where it currently resides. However, there is a law dating back to 1942, which states that all fossils are property of the state and authorization is required for exploration and excavation. And then in 1970, there was the UNESCO Convention for Illicit Trade, which Brazil ratified in 1973. And this states that goods classified as cultural property cannot leave the Brazilian territory, except for a short period, with no transference of ownership and for the purpose of cultural exchange only. In 1988, all paleontological sites and fossils are part of the cultural patrimony, thus falling under the 1973 convention. And then in 1990, if a foreigner wants to carry out fieldwork in Brazil, a formal partnership is required with a Brazilian institution, and the Brazilian partner should retain the material collected to be reposited in Brazilian scientific institutions, and this includes all holotypes and all fossil material. So obviously, this led to the question of how the fossil ended up in Germany, if actually Brazilian fossils have to stay in the country. So this led to a social media movement dedicated to its repatriation, an investigation by the Brazilian Palaeontological Society, and a temporary retraction from the publisher. The response from one of the authors were the comments made in the Brazilian press, especially regarding Brazilian paleontologists, which can be equated to xenophobia and racism. Another author responded to requests regarding documentation, which provided permits for 2 boxes of fossils, without any further information, signed by a person who has several lawsuits against them due to the forging of official documents. On the other hand, the Brazilian Mining Department, who actually is the one to offer such authorization, stated that no official authorization has ever been issued for fossils from Araripe. This was regarding another fossil, but this statement came much later than 1995. So as far as I'm aware, an investigation is still underway. So the Ubirajara specimen is only the latest of a series of smuggled fossils out of Brazil, especially out of the Araripe Basin. Up until the mid-1990s, the enforcement of the law was quite patchy. But in 2019, Brazil won a legal fight to repatriate 45 fossils to Brazil from France, which sets a precedence for other such cases. So looking at publications published on Brazilian fossils, up until the early 2000s, many of the publications did not include a Brazilian author. While this is not required by the law, this points towards little collaboration with Brazilian paleontologists during this time, and also the fact that most of the time these fossils would have been out of the country. Many recent publications on Brazilian fossils now include Brazilian paleontologists, all exclusively authored by locals. A good comparison is with Argentina, who has fared better because of the early enforcement of similar laws and the development of the field of paleontology in the country. And Brazil, up until recently, fared worse out of South American countries, despite the presence of heritage laws. So on the other side of the world now, Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country, where many important fossil primates have been found, but it's more notorious for its Cretaceous amber, which offers a window in the lives of dinosaurs, among other organisms. Myanmar amber is mostly mined in the northern state of Kachin, in the Hukong Valley in Tanai. They are then transported to be sold on the amber market of Myitkyina, or to Tengchong in the Yunnan province of China, sometimes through some not-so-legal routes. Many fossils described in the literature can probably be traced back to Tengchong, where they were bought. So Myanmar does have laws protecting fossils, but also those that allow the export of amber. We're going to discuss 2 of them, which were revised in the last years. So first of all, the Myanmar Protection of Antique Law Objects states that all fossils are considered to be antique objects. They cannot be exported without a specific permit, they cannot be sold, and knowingly searching for these objects without a permit is an offense, and all discoveries of these objects must be reported. On the other hand, the gemstone law considers amber to be a gemstone since 1995 and is owned by the state. The state grants permits to remove, process, and marketize those gemstones. Exporting does require permits and authorization, but the goal of these laws is really to support the legal trade in gemstones. So there are already reports of some scientists who get reports from those in charge of the mines when something may be of importance may have been found, which goes against the protection of antique law objects. And given the value of amber inclusions, there might be cases when people are explicitly looking for these fossils to make money off it, again, going against the antique objects law. So the question also remains, where does a fossil end and the amber start, and which law trumps the other? It's very clear that there are many that are using this loophole to get access to the amber material. However, this is a complex situation that goes beyond paleontology, and that is related to the political, economic, and legal development of the country. So in 1948, Myanmar gained independence from British rule, but until 2016, they were under military rule. So in 2016, the National League for Democracy won the elections, which was actually the first national vote since British rule, which ended the military rule. But in 2021, following another election in November 2020, there was a coup d'etat in February, which returned the country to military rule. So there has been a conflict between the Myanmar National Military and the Kachin Independence Army since the British rule ended. And both the army and the Kachin Independence Army are actually directly involved in the mining business through different companies related to them, and are known to be collecting unofficial transit duties during transportation. And at least $1 billion of legitimate amber trading takes place in the country in any given year. A single spider inclusion, for example, can be sold for $1,000 and a preserved dinosaur tail for $100,000. So in the past years, there has really been an increase in terms of publications on amber, which we see here, especially in the last 5 years. But the law dating back to fossils being classified as an antiquity dates back to 1957. 1995 was when the amber was classified as a gemstone and could be traded. And in the last years, as I said before, there was some revision. So in 2015, no exports of fossils were allowed except for temporary display or scientific preservation. And then early in 2016, there was an amendment made to the gemstone law, which actually increased the taxes to be paid by traders, which in turn increased the level of smuggling in the country, because that's the only way that the traders could actually make a profit. After the elections, the National League for Democracy decided that this law should be amended again, and it took about 2 years. The amendment reduced the tax rates, but it did little to address any illegal activities and human rights issues. So in terms of milestones with regards to dinosaurs and amber, we need to mention Jurassic Park, which was probably the first introduction to dinosaurs and amber for most paleontologists today. And during this time, the mines were still under the control of the Kachin Independence Army, who struggled to find a market for Myanmar during this time. In the year 2000, there was a publication that confirmed that Myanmar amber is actually of Cretaceous age, which kind of increased its importance. But 2010 was when the Chinese amber mines tapped out, and which also increased the Myanmar amber production because there was suddenly a market available for this amber. 2016 is really when things took off, when the first dinosaur tail with preserved feathers were found. We also see an increase in Google searches regarding Myanmar amber during that time. So it is believed that this discovery and future ones have and will fuel interest from many, including gem dealers, miners, amber hunters, and jewelers. A couple of months later, the military seized complete control of the mines, which some reports have actually directly linked to the finding of the dinosaur specimen. Since the military takeover, there have been regular attacks on the Tanai mining area, which includes aerial bombardment and heavy artillery, which has killed several civilians. Many people were driven away from their lands when the military took over the region and the mines. Some miners have stayed because there is no other way to make a living. The internally displaced people, this is the term that is used to refer to them, sometimes illegally mine amber because there isn't enough work for them and they can be shot on sight by the military forces if found. Even legal workers have lost their lives when the mines flood or cave in. Several are killed every month, and many of these workers tend to be teenagers because of how small the shafts are. There are also several alleged human rights violations and abuses by the military and secret forces in Myanmar, especially in the Kachin province. And now, after the military coup, there are reports of multiple casualties in Kachin, but the region is not really well covered by the press, so little is known about the situation. So in 2019, there was a Science magazine article exposing the provenance of Myanmar amber fossils published, and at the same time, there was the UN fact-finding report on human rights violations and abuses by the armed forces of Myanmar, which actually mentions amber quite a lot. As a result, the Society for Vertebrate Paleontology released a moratorium on publications on acquired material dating back to June 2017. Based on the data that we have, we compared publications that included research done on Myanmar fossils found in amber and those that were not found in amber. Based on the data that we have so far, none of the publications that focus on amber fossils included any local researchers. Some of those that were on other non-amber materials, so for example the primate fossils or other vertebrates, did include local researchers, not to the extent that we would like them to be, but still this shows how the gemstone law is being exploited to get access to amber fossils, which under other circumstances would have needed an export permit. We looked around 100 publications between 2017 and 2020 for any statement on the provenance of the material and the ethics of research around amber. From what we found, it would be completely accurate to say that there are more papers on Myanmar amber dedicated to Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones, which stands at a total of 1, than papers on Myanmar amber that contain a dedicated ethics statement. So basically, there were none. Only 1 mentioned an export permit, which was available on request, and 2 mentioned some sort of license. We reached out to the authors, who did send us a copy of the permit, and according to the person who acquired the fossils, a private collector, he was the only one to have had an export permit in the year of 2017. There is also the issue of who's funding research on Myanmar amber. Most researchers get their funding from governmental organizations, which can also be observed in the data that we have from the Web of Science. So indirectly, this funding may be funding a conflict and all the human rights issues that come with it. But this situation is not a unique one. A similar comparison can be made to conflict minerals mined, namely tin, tantalum, tungsten, and coltan, from the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Actually, the very device that I'm using to give this talk, or you are listening to this talk from, may contain some of these materials. So legal and illegal trade of these materials is used to fund the ongoing conflict in the region. The region's natural resource wealth is not the root cause of the violence, but competition over the lucrative mineral trades has become an incentive for some parties to continue fighting. In 2017, there was an estimated 2.7 million internally displaced people within the country due to the ongoing armed conflict. There have been also several reports on human rights abuses, including sexual violence. So these minerals end up on the global markets and are used in the production of several items. Several countries now have supply chain checks and require companies to carry out due diligence in relation to potential human rights abuses. However, many of these only apply to the importing of the raw material and not to those further down the chain, such as tech companies. As a result, most manufacturing companies do not know if their products contain conflict minerals because many companies rely on a globally dispersed supply chain. This is based on a study in the US based on disclosure reports submitted by companies between 2014 and 2016. Only 1% of the companies could confirm that the products contain conflict-free minerals. This included Apple and Intel, surprisingly. These companies perform audits of smelters to verify the provenance of their minerals and only use material from those that pass conflict-free audits. This gets us back to Myanmar amber. Once the amber reaches the markets and the gem dealers, it becomes even harder to track its provenance. Assuming that it is first of all legal to export and sell amber with fossils, and there is a need for us as paleontologists to carry out due diligence as well, not just with amber, but with any fossils that we handle. So Due diligence not only protects the people that are miles away and not connected to us, but also protects us. The Myanmar government is currently busy with other issues, but what happens when they decide to press charges and someone is arrested? This actually helps to protect the scientists and scientific institutions' self-interest by avoiding such risky behavior to start with. There are several justifications that are usually used in response of unethical and illegal behavior within the scientific community. There was no harm done. I didn't excavate it or exported it. I just studied it. This person says it's okay, so I'm going to do it. This is how it has always been done, or everyone does it. This person or country is not studying or protecting it, so I should. It's just one piece. This is for the good in science. And if I don't do this, this will be lost to science forever. We can learn a lot about ethics from the history of medicine. Credited as the father of modern gynecology, James Marion Sims developed pioneering tools and surgical techniques related to the women's reproductive health. He did so by conducting experiments on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. Critics say that Sims cared more about the experiments than in providing therapeutic treatment, and that he caused untold suffering by operating under the racist notion that Black people did not feel pain. His defenders, on the other hand, say that he was simply a man of his time, for whom the end justified the means. That enslaved women with the condition that he was treating were likely to have wanted the treatment badly enough that they would have agreed to take part in his experiments. But history hasn't recorded voices of these women. The legal requirement at the time was only consent from the slaveholders. So it's very important to think about whose perspectives are being centered when we talk about such topics. Coming back to paleontology, what critics say regarding the laws is that it interferes with science because and that they are discriminatory. And that when the animals that roamed the earth a few million years ago, that eventually became fossils, there were no political borders. But again, whose perspectives are being centered here? The laws and regulations are actually not intended primarily as an impediment to science, but on the other hand, they are intended as measures to help support the development and growth of the local scientific community. So this sort of thinking is actually rooted in scientific colonialism. We've been talking about scientific colonialism for a while now, but what is it exactly? Scientific colonialism can be defined as the process where knowledge about a certain nation resides outside of that nation itself. This can be due to the biases in the distribution of accumulation of knowledge during colonial times, when one claims the right to access data from other countries, or when one exports data from another country to have it studied there. When it comes to paleontology, what does this really mean? The questions that we are asking are, were specimens or paleontological finds taken in a colonial context? What were the researchers or explorers' relationships with local communities then, and what are they now? Do we cooperate with researchers or communities from these regions today? Do we talk about the origins of our collections? So basically, during colonial times, colonizers considered it their right to take these fossils and other artifacts back to the homeland. We asked ourselves whether anything has changed since. A little bit. But still, most of the paleontological knowledge is concentrated in Northern America and the Western Europe. The lighter colors here on the map shows the ones where local researchers are regularly either carrying out the work or involved on the publications. You can already see that high-income countries tend to fare better than others. There are some African countries that do have the involvement of local researchers, but the rest of Africa and Central Asia are the ones with the most evidence of parachute science, where foreign researchers are coming, collecting the data, and then leaving. South America, especially in the last years, Argentina and Brazil tend to be the major actors in the region. So archaeology is a field that is very similar to paleontology, and discussion around ethics started as a response to the legacy of colonialism in the field. In the mid-1980s, there was a major movement during which archaeologists started addressing the socio-political context within which their research was being carried out. And this led to the establishment of the World Archaeological Congress. One of the aims, as per the website, is to provide training and public education for disadvantaged nations, groups, and communities, the empowerment and support of indigenous group and First Nations people. The development of codes of ethics in archaeology also addresses illicit antiquities trade, and this is adopted not only by museums and professional bodies, but also by some university departments. For example, the International Council of Museums, the ICOM, opposes acting in any way that could be regarded as benefiting such illicit trade, directly or indirectly. Another one states that an archaeologist shall not engage in and shall seek to discourage illicit or unethical dealings in antiquities. Again, another one says that archaeologists should refuse to participate in the trade of undocumented antiquities by refraining from activities that enhance the commercial value of such objects. Many similar codes of ethics can be found within paleontological professional societies and natural history museums that are also part of ECOM. But I don't know how they are enforced or what sanctions are taken against those that violate them. This leads us to the question, why is fossil smuggling so common? It's definitely a complex problem, but at the core is the demand and supply issue. As we have already established, smuggling and illicit trading is not only a problem that exists within paleontology. Black markets exist for several items such as guns, drugs, and also wildlife. Ivory trade is such an example. It is estimated that around 20,000 elephants are killed each year for ivory. But according to a study, the rate of African elephants killed each year declined between the years 2011 and 2017. And this has been directly linked to reduced demand for ivory across China as a result of an economic slump. This was even before the country introduced a ban on ivory trade. So this shows that while laws and regulations may limit trade, black markets will still exist if there is demand for a product. Within paleontology, dinosaurs and vertebrates in general tend to be at the center of the illegal fossil trade. And that's because the public loves dinosaurs. So scientists and non-scientists alike, they are fascinated by it. And the very fact that they are so popular could be feeding the frenzy around the fossil discussed here. Especially the exceptional preservation of specimens in amber means that they are even more impressive. This is one of the reasons that many such impressive fossils, not restricted to dinosaurs only, end up in the hands of private collectors or sold for outrageous prices, never to be researched again. There is one thing to think about then. Just because paleontologists stop working on these fossils does not mean that these issues will disappear. So we know that dinosaurs are very popular and that dinosaurs amber are even more so. So what does the data say? We looked at the old metric scores of dinosaur publication. The old metric score basically shows how much attention a publication has received on social media and in the news. We focus on papers in Nature and Science only because these are the elite journals in which such extraordinary discoveries are published. So we compared paleontological publications, divided them between those that had the term dinosaur in the title and those that did not, and the publications on Myanmar amber only. In general, dinosaur papers tend to receive more attention than non-dinosaur papers, but this difference is even more when you look at Myanmar papers. Here is a book that was recommended to me that I haven't read yet, but which I think might provide a lot of insights into dinosaur poaching. At the very basis of all of this, says the author, is the fascination of these fossils by the people actually smuggling them. So what we need in paleontology and in science in general is a human rights-based approach. What does this mean? This means accepting that science is a socially organized activity that is shaped by organizational structures and procedures. We need to understand how a science bridges with human rights. We need to have a clear idea regarding international human rights instruments, including laws, regulations, and conventions. And we need to promote these regulatory processes to have a proper balance between human rights and science. There already exists a UNESCO recommendation for scientific researchers, and member states are actually required to develop necessary protocols and policies to monitor this. So as individuals or organizations, we should also take action. We cannot control the laws of politics, but we can control our workplace and how we conduct and communicate our research. And especially those in positions of power should take the lead to ensure this. So the current academic currency is publications, which often leads to unethical transgressions because of this push to discover the extraordinary. So that we make it in prestigious journals in order to advance our careers. But this also provides a way to regulate the research that is currently being done. So the scientist does not only do research, they usually submit grant proposals for funding, which is reviewed by other scientists. When we submit our manuscript for publications, an editor, also another scientist, determines whether this goes to review. Other scientists review the manuscript and they, together with the editor, make the decision whether this is to be published. The more publications, the more recognition the scientist gets, which leads to promotions and tenure. And the modern scientist is also a teacher, a manager, and a science communicator. So we are at the center of this cycle, which also means that we are at the front line to advance our discipline. So the next time you get to review something or you get to work on a fossil, ask yourself how it got from where it was dug up to where it currently is. I'm going to leave it here with a list of questions that we as scientists should think about once in a while in order to remain true to the goals of science and to ourselves. What is science for? What are the values that I bring to my scientific work? Why did I become a scientist and why am I one now? And what are the moral motivations, inclinations, and principles at the heart of my scientific pursuits? And whom does my research serve? As I said, this is part of a bigger project that I've been working on. So to keep up with the work that we are doing, you can visit the website that we have here, and definitely feel free to get in touch if you have any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nussaibah. It's a fascinating discussion, particularly something that's often rooted in anecdotes, but actually having hard data and means of quantifying it. It was very fascinating. I was wondering, in terms of the destination of this research, do you have particular outcomes that you're intended to reach, or where can you see the research going?
So we are just compiling the data. So I obviously have my own opinions, but I really want people to make their own opinions based off the data that we are collecting and presenting. So hopefully we will be making this available very soon as we've collected it and compiled everything. And I really hope that this helps to bring the change that we need, because a lot of times we are asked, okay, so we kind of know that this is happening, but there is no data to back it up. Well, for us, it's we are taking our time to provide this data so that people who can actually make changes can use this to back their decisions, hopefully.
Okay, we have a question from Thomas. He says, great talk, Nussaibah, and asks, do you know if government or public funding generally comes with rules or clauses that it cannot be used in a way that might lead to human rights abuses? Could that be a way of putting pressure on less ethically minded researchers? Any thoughts?
Well, I would assume that the member states that ratify the UNESCO conventions would have this within their rules and clauses, but I haven't looked actively in terms of what are the rules with regards to public funding. But I definitely think that this would be a way to put pressure on the people. But at the same time, I think that funders leave it usually to the grant reviewers to make the decisions. And it's like, okay, we have this money here, but you make the decisions. So in terms of regulatory processes, I don't think so. Who is going to report this? That this might link to human rights abuses if the reviewer does not do this?
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think it's, we've talked about this before, and the whole process of the behavior has to be validated, not just in terms of the way that the research funders behave, but also the institutions that employ the researchers and also the publications and their guidelines. There has to be sort of checks at each stage, because in a way, sort of saying, putting in a guideline saying, you mustn't have any human rights abuses if you're going to take this money. It's one of those things that most people, I'm pretty sure, would not have in as their guidance, because it's so blindingly obvious that you shouldn't be doing that it just would go unsaid. So of course that leaves the loophole of deniability.
I really think that it's when things are unsaid that these problems tend to rise up, because if you actually have these clearly written down, there's more of a responsibility to not do this or to check this out.
Okay, there's a as you can imagine, there's a number of issues arising that you might be familiar with. Mark says, very interesting talk. Do you think we should bring pressure to bear on museums to repatriate fossils and artifacts taken from other countries? One example that springs to mind is that old chestnut, the Erlangen marbles in the British Museum, amongst other artifacts. What do you think, Nussaibah?
Yes, definitely. But like, actually, I have read the Code of Ethics of Museums several times now, and it is within the Code of Ethics that they have to make sure that they repatriate them at some point. Well, when this is going to happen and how this is going to happen, I think we can't decide. It's up to the museums, but I'm hoping that it will be soon. But again, there are a lot of justifications for museums why they should not repatriate them, which leads to, again, this idea that, like other people can't take care of it as we can. But this is just not true. This is, again, just this thinking that they're not as good as us. And if you look at museums here, there are basements that are flooded all the times and everything. So it's not a right justification. So yes, I am all for it.
Yeah, and I remember my first museum, there was very much it seemed to be so ubiquitous that the geology stores were basements and flooded, that it was almost like it was some sort of requirement somewhere that you had to store your geological specimens below the water table. So that's a fairly standard problem. Gary says, eBay is flooded with Burmese, amber, Chinese and Mongolian fossils. What can one do?
Report it. It is illegal. So you see it, you report it. That's the best thing you can do.
Well, that's actually a nice short answer for what could have been a very, very long answer. So yeah, that goes for it. Jessica Theodore asks, is there any new information on what is happening in the amber market as a result of the coup in Myanmar? I mean, it was very interesting, the timeline that you drew up in terms of the military handing over to a democratic government and then changing the legislation, almost like they were planning for their own future in terms of making money out of it. Is there any information? I mean, obviously it's only a few weeks old as a story, but have you heard anything on the grapevine?
So from what I've heard, the mining itself is not happening at the moment because of the protest and everything else that's happening within the coup. But within the market in Myanmar itself, I don't know. But China does have a stock of amber that it releases once in a while. So in terms of amber market, amber is still going to be available because of the stocks that are there outside of the country. But within the country, I really have no idea.
Yes, it is pretty fresh as a development, so it'll take some time for that information to get out. A couple of other perspectives. Darren observes, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that will have similar stories. 2005, I was on a dinosaur dig in Mongolia. We had paperwork from the highest levels of the Mongolian government to be there. One day while in the field, two men in official uniforms drove up and demanded to see our papers. They said our papers were not proper. It was a very awkward situation, lots of heated debate. They eventually left, and later I was told they were probably looking for a bribe. How are we to protect fossils from illicit trade when the people hired to do just that are themselves corrupt?
That's a very good question. I don't know, but I think as long as we ourselves don't engage in this illicit trade, the demand is going to reduce. And at some point they will realize, hopefully, that it's not really worth it, because the effort that they will put in trying to get this bribe or to do this will not bring them to anything. So I think there's two things. So there are people who actively try to engage in this and people who don't. And we do have to go towards, we don't have to engage in the illicit trade. So if you know that this was illegally acquired, don't buy it, don't take it, don't work on it, is my answer to this. With regards to the people, I really don't know.
I mean, that is a tough one. I mean, I know other people who've had this issue in Mongolia, and also where I used to work in Yunnan province in China. This was a problem. There was a colleague I can remember who went over to look for a dinosaur egg site, and the local authorities were going to take them to the site and show them around. And so they drove them around for a day and didn't seem to actually find the site, and then took them back. And so people then went home, and afterwards they were told, yeah, they were actually waiting for you to give them a financial sum, and then they would have brought you quite quickly to find the site that they had agreed to bring you to. So there's, I mean, there are cultural aspects there, and there is, of course, it's all got to do with institutional willingness and how the institution operates and the legislation supporting it. So I mean, Darren's example is very far from isolated, and it is problematic. There's sort of it reminds me a little bit of the Brazilian dinosaur fossil, where there was supposedly some form of permission granted and given to the researcher, but as far as the government is concerned, it has no legal standing whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's effectively, you can have a good faith actor, but in that situation, there's no difference in terms of the end result of the material leaving illegally. It doesn't really make much difference whether you had a local actor who was facilitating what you were doing, if it's still illegal.
I really think that in such situations that I think the reasons that this might happen as well is because we are not taught about how to deal with such situations, and we are not taught about the laws I mean, I'm not saying we have to learn all the laws of the different countries, but you actually have to learn how, I think as paleontologists, to learn how to apply for a permit, who to contact. So try to get official permission. I think you tend to have also less of this issue if you're working with a local researcher because of this cultural aspect of it. So I think it's just about learning to work with this, and how to deal with these situations is very important. And this is something that we as students were not taught, which obviously then we bring to the field when we become fully fledged researchers. And this cycle continues. So we need to start somewhere, definitely.
This actually bridges on to another question from Juan, who says, as a student, I'm a bit afraid of being political and addressing the colonialism. And because of that, in the future, possibly being prevented of developing my academic career by small-minded researchers. How can I fight this, or what can I do about it?
Well, as a student, I'm being political, and I can tell you it's very scary. I think you need to try to find people within your department that you can talk to about this, or at least people within the community. The professional societies that I have talked to and with whom I've evolved, they are very supportive, especially of students. So reach out to whichever society you're part of and talk about these um, issues, or rather fears that you have, and how you can protect yourself from this if there's any backlash. Like students shouldn't have to pay for this for doing the right thing.
That's good words. Okay, let's go for a boot on the other foot question. So Nizar says, I work very closely with scientists and students in Africa, and I've devoted years of my career to building up paleontological collections in North Africa. What does the speaker think about Brazilian scientists who are very vocal about protecting Brazilian fossils, publishing on Moroccan fossils with no official export paperwork by Moroccan authorities and without the inclusion of Moroccan co-authors? And then there's a series of references suggested with yes, well, I think you can see them. So there's a series of examples. So I don't know if you'd like to say anything to that.
Well, I have issues with that as well. So I really think, so whether you are from, let's say, Germany, which is where I am, or from Brazil, you should act the way you want to be treated. So if Brazilians are protecting their fossils, but then working on other fossils from other countries without any official exported paperwork, it's basically being a hypocrite, right? Like, you want your fossils to be here, but it doesn't matter if you're working on other things. So the issues that I brought here, yes, there is a colonial aspects to it. There are colonial aspects to it, but the problem is that we as paleontologists from all around the world, we are taking in all of these this culture. So I'm from Mauritius, for example, but I work in Germany, and there is this culture, or when I was in Britain, for example, that I assimilated, and this is how I acted. So I think this is like a problem within paleontology as a whole. So not just from particular countries that used to be colonial powers, but everywhere you do see this. And the whole discipline basically just needs a revamp.
Yeah, it does become that cultural learned behavior. And what's interesting is, of course, the more international your collaborations or your research course can be, then the more you might be influenced from a very different background in terms of being trained in what should be in what is acceptable. And that just follows a particular academic family style, if you like, rather than anything else. Yeah, it doesn't excuse it. The fact that it's a Brazilian researcher doing it in Morocco or vice versa. It's not as simple as just colonialism. There's a neo-colonialism aspect to it. I was going to say we've had a question from Mark. Could we encourage a code of practice whereby whenever a field trip is conducted abroad, at least one local scientist takes part in the field trip and that they have a responsible role on the management team? I can say one thing initially before you come back on that within SVP and the ethics code that we have, it is the responsibility of anybody working in any territory to make themselves absolutely familiar with the legislation that applies in terms of getting permits, in terms of permission to prospect, excavate, and if necessary, remove the material. So that's absolutely incumbent. But what Mark's suggesting is the idea of the local scientist taking part in some way in the field trip. Anything?
I think this theoretically is a good idea, but I do think that when you do this, you do have to think about whether the labor of the local scientist is being properly remunerated, are you asking them to work for free just so that you can ensure that you have you are abiding to the code of ethics or practice that you are abiding to, or are you just using them to tick a box? Yes, we included a local researcher. Or are you actively collaborating with this person to develop this teaching course? Or with regards to a collaboration, are they equal in terms of collaboration, or are you just using them for posting the fossils to the institutions where all the research is going to be done? So including a local scientist, whether in fieldwork or in research, yes, definitely. But I think the terms of this collaboration should also be important.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I can remember an example of one individual who was implied as sort of like a local token name. And the lead author said that they definitely made sure that everybody actually made a real contribution. But then in the same breath would say that, yeah, they just drove us to the field every day. So it was like taxi driver, therefore getting a publication, getting their name on the publication list. A little bit of a historical question from Darren, of course. Is it known when fossil poaching or illegal shipping of fossils overseas began? What is the oldest documented case? I know what I would have a guess at for that. Do you want to have a go?
I don't know. I would say check the museums.
Yeah, I think you can. It'd be interesting to see if anybody could find or suggest in the chat any ideas pre-empire days, or
I would love to know.
Yeah, no, that is interesting because as a behavior pattern, it goes back a long, long way. We have a comment from Priscilla. Says, Nussaibah, thanks for a fantastic talk. Also, thanks for highlighting your experience of racism. My own interactions with them were unfortunately not better. What do you think ought to be the leverage points for ethical scientists wishing to do research in countries with a weak legal safety net to pressure these governments to get cracking with improving regulations, policies, enforcement, monitoring of scientific malpractice?
I think in this case, I mean, that's hard, right? Because you would basically be going there and telling them what to do, which is also not right. But I think we do need the discussions with everyone at the table. So I think the conventions are really good for that, where people lay down their problems and the problems that they have had. And all the member states that are part of these conventions should ratify it and make sure that it's enforced. So this is, for example, the UNESCO Convention in 1970 on the illegal antiquities, which has really worked because a lot of member states signed it, and they are, I mean, some of them are better than others, but they do have this within their legislations now. So this would be a good way, I would think, to start it, to have clear discussions with everyone.
Yeah, I think that I mean, taking your point that you can't so obviously go into another country and then start pressurizing the local legislation, but I do think that paleontologists have a responsibility to act as scientists relating to their own governments in terms of ensuring that the legislation is up to standard. Otherwise, you know, there's no point in complaining about it. If it's not functioning correctly, you have to be able to be prepared to try and apply some pressure for the change. One response actually back from Rebecca, who says, in answer to the question, how do we protect fossils from corrupt locals, then see lessons from big cat conservation research like Panther. Teach locals it's more valuable to protect and guard the fossils versus to sell them.
So very good way to do it. Yeah.
I think actually, ironically, the example that springs to my mind first is actually the south coast of England, where it was a means of working with local collectors trying to get them on board was to do that. And obviously that's not within necessarily a corrupt or necessarily a colonial environment, but that model does occur within paleontology. Chris asks, do you have any sense of the number of societies or publishers who have requirements related to ethical collecting as part of the criteria for considering a manuscript for publication? In other words, do professional societies need to take on a bigger role?
So because I'm now part of SVP, I know they have this. I'm assuming that others would have, but really I don't know because I haven't actively looked into it. But that does make a very good point, because this is important, and the more people who support this, the better. So I will actually check this out at some point this week. Do you have an idea, Jeff? You probably know better than me.
No, I was just thinking back to the response to SVP's letter to publishers last year, where there seemed to be quite a few publishers who took on board that for their journals that they should implement some ethical aspects relating specifically to Myanmar amber specimens. But in terms of numbers, no, I'd have to check on that. We have, Rich says, what about situations where there are conflicts between legal governments and indigenous peoples? For instance, a researcher goes through all the proper channels, has all the legal paperwork from the government in charge, but then are confronted by local indigenous people who have been overruled by the government. I know that's super complex, but I do worry about this, especially in the US and other places where the people living on the land have no legal say in what happens. And of course, I think this, he says that your story about your fun field trip in Morocco actually reminded him of this situation.
So to this, I'm going to say what is legal is not always ethical. And what is ethical is not always legal. So I would say that as a paleontologist, we should do what's legal, but also what is ethical. So in terms of that, it's up to you to decide where your morals lie and which ethics actually you want to follow.
Okay. Royal family are getting a bit of stick this week, so it seems only appropriate to go to Xian's question. Excellent talk and presentation. One question, what's your take about the Malta shark fossil that David Attenborough presented to Prince George? I was not aware of that. Had you?
Yeah, me neither. So maybe can Chen provide a bit more information about this so that we can actually comment? Like, I didn't know, so.
No, I've not heard of it. Let's see. Ava actually provides a response very kindly for Phil Curry. Officially, the first illegal export would be the American Museum of Natural History taking fossils out of Mongolia in 1925. That would be because the Mongolians passed their laws in 1924. That's correct. I don't know, but I suspect that it might go back a lot older than that in other countries. But yes, in terms of the legislation, the 1924 one is the one that is one of the older ones regarding countries that tend to have their material taken. Let me see. Jessica comes back and says, several journals have established policies on amber as a result of SVP's ban. And I know of at least one journal that just asked for more information from us. That's good to know. It's the SVP president. Okay. Iris asks a slightly easier question. What would the speaker advise my 10-year-old niece, whom has shown a lot of interest in this field? And also asking from the point of view as a woman in science.
Okay, so I know who Iris is, so I'm gonna say I will talk to you at some point and we can talk about this. But in general, I think it's very good to expose children who are interested in this to museums. Well, obviously in Corona times that is a bit harder to do, but you do have, like, for example, these virtual exhibits that you can talk about. There's a lot of talks online about dinosaurs, which I think would be very interesting. And there are a lot of very good science communicators out there doing very good things. So I'll put you in touch with them.
I think it's especially true that in the time of COVID, the amount of online resources that are accessible by such people has obviously blossomed astronomically. And of course, we have great online resources provided here at the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology. Plug. Danielle says, I have a slight concern with the prospect of projects or groups shopping for local researchers that may be less stringent in their application of local cultural preservation, or perhaps a local researcher that does not represent the interests of a specific culture within a region. This could be especially problematic in multicultural nations with minority ethnic groups. I was wondering about your thoughts on how we make sure that working with a local researcher does not become a box to check with certain groups.
That is certainly true. So I can only talk about my experiences with that. I don't know if it's right or not, but I did reach out to several organizations who then put me in contact with people who might be interested, rather than me saying, oh, this person would be very interesting to work with, or this person might have an idea of what to do, or they just tick this box. So use professional societies or other organizations. So I can only mention the Geolatinas right now, who did help me to reach out to colleagues in South America when I was researching this, and they were super helpful. So do make use of organizations like this to get in contact with people.
Yeah, I take the point. It is a difficult one, because you go in through an official institution. I mean, if the easiest way is if you have a formal collaboration with a department that's on the ground there, then you can be, I think, fairly confident about who's being selected and what their skills are and how reliable they are, and that there's not any other vested interests, financial or otherwise. But yes, you just have to go in with your eyes open and not just accept the path of least resistance and the easiest one, because if it seems too easy, then it probably is for a reason, and it's really a matter of check and check again. Tom brings forward the very valid point of why should the construct of the nation state own or control fossils' fate rather than a private landowner or indigenous people or a county council. With that tends to just vary massively according to whichever nation state you're in as to what the priorities are. I mean, I think yourself, Nussaibah, in Germany, it varies hugely just from landa to landa.
Exactly. So I really think this so it's not all nation states that own the fossils, right? So this depends on the countries, and sometimes the private landowner does have it, or the indigenous people have it as well. So that's true, but this is something that is beyond our control, I would say.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. I mean, it's again, I think that comes back to the idea that the local paleontologists have to be the ones to try and set the legislation or the guidance that is appropriate for the fossils within their area. Some again, for the nation state, changed boundaries, laws, and degrees of governance. Yeah, I mean, is it enough to be legal at the time of export? Well, not always. I mean, you can subsequently, these, you know, any given nation state can reverse its position and retrospectively declare things that were legally exported before now not illegally exported. It's a, you know, it's a bit of a strong arm strategy, but it's not unknown for that to happen. And again, there really aren't any guarantees. Amanda says, what can non-scientists do to help support human rights as they relate to fossil collection?
Well, it depends what you mean by non-scientists to start with. I think, do we consider people who work in museums as non-scientists, or are they, do you consider them to be scientists? But I think in general, there is this lack of understanding of how fossils can relate to human rights, whether this is for scientists or non-scientists. I think for archaeology, for example, it's a bit easier because there's this human factor that is connected, and it becomes a bit easier to explain how these are related. So in generally, I would say not just to non-scientists, we need better communication regarding this. We need to learn how our work is affecting the broader society, because as scientists ourselves, we tend to be like so focused on what we're doing that we kind of forget what is happening elsewhere. But this is what we are focusing on, is what tends to go to the public and what tends to end up in videos or other measures of scientific communication. So I think in general, we need better communication regarding this.
Amanda, if you want to come back on that and develop the question as to whether that answered it or not, then please do. Mm-hmm. Let's just turn it around a little bit. Ian says, what are the ethics of working on fossils collected here in Canada on lands that were initially violently seized from Indigenous peoples? Yeah. That's a fine question.
So I don't know much about Canada, so maybe some of the people at the museum may know better, but I do know that there are some laws regarding archaeological work in Canada. So I wonder if these were to on Indigenous land, but I don't know about the ones that were seized from them. So really, I cannot weigh in on this because I don't know much about it.
Darren, if you have a comment on that, that would be good to hear. Aline says, what should the academic community do regarding researchers who have regularly demonstrated unethical behavior and openly support fossil trafficking?
Well, I think I know who you're talking about.
Maybe.
I definitely think that there should be sanctions against these people. But unfortunately, this lies with the institution where they are employed. And when these people still bring funding and papers in nature or science, they're still considered very valuable despite what they're doing, unfortunately. So there is this systematic problem where this basically trumps everything else that they do. And there should be a change in how institutions or even professional societies deal with such behaviors. Like, it's unacceptable, and I really don't understand how this continues to happen.
Money.
Yeah.
We have a few more questions, but I quickly just wanted to do the plug, which I should have done earlier, saying next week's presentation will be from Ashley Reynolds, University of Toronto, and it will be on the North Remembers Ice Age fossil finds from the city of Medicine Hat, Alberta. But we can still finish off a couple more questions. one Dan says, are there any good sources for finding out the provenance of artifacts? Any red flags to keep an eye out for? I'm not sure. From my own experience, I'm not sure beyond just, once you've been working in the field for a while, which areas you have to be suspicious of. But any thoughts yourself?
Well, I think that if you come across something, obviously you will know where they come from, well, hopefully. And I think it's basically look up the laws, what is needed, ask how it got here. Like I now, because of the research we've been doing, know a lot about Brazilian fossils and Myanmar amber and a bit about Mongolian fossils. But it's really about you check if is it actually supposed to be here to start with? Like, is it even legal for it to be here? How did it get here? Ask the people. So if you're working with museums, that's a bit easier because they tend to have documentation for this, whether it's field notes or just a little paper that said, okay, this was donated by this person. But I think in terms of red flags, like as you said, like it's certain areas that that you should be aware about, and others that okay, this was probably legit. So just ask the questions.
I think in response to the eBay question earlier, Rob says, you say that we should report fossils that are offered online. Whom do we report it to?
Well, hopefully we can get the professional societies on board for this, because they would be the ones dealing with fossils, and they can probably help us with dealing with the laws then, or getting to the right people to get this sorted out. I mean, this is obviously an issue because if it's on eBay, it's like a private person actually put it there. So can you actually, you have to report it to the police eventually and say, okay, look, this is illegal. But which country or which authorities you actually reported to, I don't know, but contact your paleontological professional society.
Okay. One thought I was going to say earlier, you were talking about the if a nation doesn't want its own material to be exported, then it shouldn't allow the sale of other nations on its doorstep. I do remember coming across a stall in China, and all of the specimens were from China and for sale. Except that you realized after a while that some of them looked awfully like Green River fishes from America, and others from Kupferschiefer and Solnhofen specimens from Germany. And basically they had been taken in, but they were sold as being completely homegrown. And again, you'd only know that if you were familiar with the field and recognizing the specimens. So it does make it difficult. Tom asks regarding sanctions, would flagging things up in the paleobiology database be a possible sanction, or does that indeed already happen?
So I don't think this happens, but I can tell you that all the data that I have actually comes from the PBDB. So we can already see this sort of pattern within the data that is already in there. So I think this would be up to the PBDB community committee to act upon this. But in terms of, so the data that we have, yes, it's from the PBDB, but we did add additional data to be able to see where the researchers are affiliated. So there needs to be basically something within the database itself that can get this data out for us to be able to flag that. But I mean, we've already done the work for about 30 years, so they can just implement something that continues it for 2021 and
beyond,
further on. Yeah, basically.
Yeah, well, it's Pat's on that group, so I'm sure she will facilitate that. That's good. I was going to say we've got a question from Eric. Is ethics a topic that's important for leading institutions or journals in paleontology? How would you convince the old guard to change? And do you need a massive discussion about values in science? Which I guess is kind of what we're doing today.
Yeah, so Eric, who's just across from me there. Yes, we do need a massive discussion. So in terms of paleontological societies, you already have like code of ethics in place. So these need to be regularly revised and updated, in my opinion. So just because you have something from 30 years ago, you do still need to update it. It certainly doesn't apply. But in terms of journals, so we had this talk to one editor who said that it's easier to implement legal stuff than ethical stuff. But eventually, I do hope that this becomes part of leading journals to have at least ethics statement to start with, so that we start somewhere to develop this and to require this discussion. But I think the problem is that the publishers themselves of these journals, they only care about the money and not the journal itself. So it's a question of who's actually going to implement this change, whether it's going to be a publisher-wide movement. And I think then they will ask themselves, what do we gain from this? Or should it be like at the journal level? So the editorial board decides, okay, this is what we're going to do. So there is a need for a discussion, but I don't know how to start this discussion with editors. So if anyone has any ideas, I would be totally up for a chat.
Cool. I think we might finally have managed to get all the questions. You'll be very pleased to know. Darren sadly didn't come back to us on the indigenous question, but that's fine. Okay, so with that, it falls to me to say, Nussaibah, thank you very much for your time today and taking us through this very complex and intertwined minefield in terms of how we deal with this material and all the historical baggage that's tied up with it. And it's great the work that you and Emma and your group are doing in terms of being able to statistically present some of these issues in terms of how different territories have manifestations of local researchers, for example. And wish you every success going forward.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again. Like, it was awesome.
And thank you very much to everybody tuning in. And as I said, next week, Ashley Reynolds, The North Remembers. And with a title like that, it's never going to be a bad talk.
It's gonna be
Thank
good.
you very much and goodbye.
Bye.